And we are back. Welcome, poets, poetesses, writers and readers, aspiring writers and aspiring readers. We are back with a new episode of the New Lyre podcast, and we have here our recurring guest and chief essayist, Adam Sedia. Welcome, Adam.
Good to be back.
Yes, it's good to be back. This is actually, I just realized, our first episode of the new year, 2022. A lot has happened, which is partly why we've been absent for so long. I mean, we switched gears, and there's been a lot going on, and we have been busy working on the New Lyre's second issue, which is now out, and everybody can get a copy. And so this episode is dedicated to addressing the state of poetry. And I think people will agree once they read this issue, or even just get an idea of what's in it, if they go to newlyre.com and they see the samples that we've posted to give people a sense of what they can expect. Poetry is alive and well, Adam.
Well, in certain circles it is. I think I wouldn't state that as a universal proposition by any means, but I think we're injecting some strong medicine into it.
Right, absolutely. And we're going to have a casual discussion here, and we're actually going to read various pieces published in the latest issue to give people a living sense of that, and especially giving them a sense of the recitation of these poems, right, which is also something that has largely been lost. And partially, one could argue quite confidently that that's partially why poetry in the last, I would say, century, the century of modernism and all its spawns, not that there weren't good things, but poetry has suffered in that we've lost the oral tradition, right? The tradition of storytelling. And,
I mean, very much so. Poetry is born from music, really. It's born from oral recitation. And how many, the fact that poetry exists in non-literate societies, tells you how universal it is. It's broader and antecedent to even the written word itself. And I think you're absolutely correct. In the last century, there's been such a focus on the written word. Again, a lot of it has to do with expanding literacy, but one of the casualties of that is oral poetry. And when the reader when one is a reader rather than a hearer of poetry, poetry takes a different form, and it can do all sorts of funky things on the page that wouldn't translate well into spoken word, or that are impossible to be conveyed through the spoken word. Ezra Pound is a perfect example of that. Those poems do not exist independently of their writing, and you cannot say the same thing for Homer or Virgil or even Dante.
right. And I mean, we've been having a lot of conversations, unrecorded conversations, and I think we'll be bringing in a lot of that into this recorded conversation. And two of the things that we were talking about, I mean, I correspond with all sorts of different folks in the literary world, and the question of poetry being made of words, poems being made of words, and poems being first and foremost words, was brought up as a concept, and we were talking about that. And one of the first things that you said, Adam, was that actually poetry is primarily not made of words. It's ideas. Words are vehicles for ideas, and I think that's really one of the functions of poetry, is to rise above words, right? To actually get to the nuance and substantive content of a work, such that it raises people to the level of ideas, which are what lie behind the words or behind the lines. And that's really what needs to be discovered when we're reading a truly great piece of classical poetry. That's what the poet is trying to express.
Exactly. And the what that conversation referenced, and I'm going to paraphrase here, is a quote from Stefan Mallarmé, when he was asked by a friend if he had any good ideas, and he said, "Yes, but poems are made of words, not ideas." Which I found surprising for a member of the symbolist school, which a large, and again, not to pigeonhole him into a broad category, but the whole idea behind that movement was, something akin to Yeats, where the poetry stood for a deeper symbolic meaning. So ideas were very heavily imbued in that style. But the symbolist poets in their technique too have been likened to impressionists, which really achieved the same thing in paint, rather than depicting objects as composed of colors. They depicted the color and light individually and let the object be composed from that. And that sort of, and the same thing happened in music with Debussy. There's that whole impressionist school, and the symbolist poets are kind of linked to that with their sensitivity to the sound and the color of words, and it's very sensual, but it's ultimately not very deep, and it ignores what words in fact are. They're not just sounds. In fact, I pulled out my volume here. There's a modernist, actually postmodernist German, I hesitate to call it a poem, and I'm trying to find it in here. But what it is it's just random sounds written on a page, things like, I hope I can find this. Just random, here we go. His name is Ernst Jandl, and he was born in 1925, and I'm just going to read an excerpt of what he calls a poem. It's Schitzgrim, Schitzgrim, and it goes on like that for like 50 lines. And I'm not making this up.
Of course it does. I mean, of course it does. Oh, yeah.
But I guess my point is that what is poetic about that? It's my 2-year-old can do that. Words exist to convey ideas, and it's putting them together to create something that has meaning to both the poet and the reader. It's a means of communication, and what is it communicating? An idea that has meaning to both the poet and the reader. If we can't get past that, we might as well say poetry doesn't exist, or there's no such thing as language.
Well, right. I mean, here's the crazy thing, and I guess we're diving deep already into some of the larger questions that come into view when we really consider what's at stake here, when we talk about having a genuine literate culture, a poetic culture, right? A people that is able to think, to grasp poetical concepts as opposed to literal concepts, right? Or simple or just prose. There's a big difference. And I mean, with the example you just gave and what you were talking about with just the idea of poems are made of words and the impressionism, I mean, right there, we also have another ism. There's a lot of isms, actually. That's one of the problems. Deconstructionism, right? There's been this long project of deconstructing language, which is really about destroying ideas more than anything else, in my opinion. And I think we can talk a bit.
And yeah, not to interrupt you, but yeah, I am intimately familiar with deconstruction. I've read, to the extent one can read, Derrida's essays on it, and the thing about it is it's absolutely destructive, because it's as its name indicates, its entire point is to interpret literature, things that are purported to have meaning, into absurdity. But it provides no meaning. At the core of its, I'll call it a philosophy, at the core of its belief is an utter nihilism, an utter belief in the meaninglessness of everything. So if you can make Shakespeare absurd, you can do that with anything. He becomes meaningless. He becomes a laughing stock, an absurdity. So what really is there out in the universe to admire or inspire us? It's a very depressing, nihilistic view of things. And I think it has attraction in academic circles because, in order to interpret something to the point of absurdity, you have to have a creative mental process and a large background. It helps to have a culture, to be culturally literate. So it's kind of an exercise in mental gymnastics. I'll refrain from using another term. A mental navel gazing that attracts people who pride themselves on how smart they are, and that's why it's been able to gain, such a ground among academia.
I think it's unfortunately true, but I mean, I think it actually explains a lot. And one of the things that we were remarking, which is partly why I think poetry has suffered, the biases, right? That the irony is that the literary world, some of the strongest biases are among the literati, right? Among the literary intelligentsia.
Absolutely true.
And they're not really that good of a test, right? Or gauge for whether something is truly timeless, whether you actually have an original work in the greater sense of the word. Maybe there's novelty, right? Maybe the person is doing something different stylistically, playing with language in a certain way, and people are like, ooh, that's new. But it doesn't really mean it's original or timeless. And the example that I gave to you and that I was discussing with somebody else, where I was kind of forced to come up with a metaphor, I would say the passing the poetry around the fire test, right? If you're going to gather with a bunch of people with all sorts of different backgrounds and everything, and actually have something like a storytelling culture where
The caveat is you're not on a college campus when you do that.
Yeah, even then, I think good poetry it's actually a potentially effective flank if it's actually beautiful. It's very disarming. Beauty is very disarming, and it smokes out some of the more the real misanthropes, right? The ones that actually just hate beauty and hate anything that has some sort of semblance of tradition, right? Because this is year zero, and we've deconstructed the language, we've deconstructed everything. We have 1,000 different isms, and you're not supposed to be talking about these things from the past, right? They're dead, and they're just a bunch of dead white European males. So shut your mouth, and go back to composing sounds, right? Composing sound poems or whatnot. So I think that's one of the big problems, right? If poetry is really going to transcend the current zeitgeist, it's a question of, this is never a bad thing, right? Becoming mindful and aware of our own biases and how we've been influenced by the many things around us, right? The many different ideas, and to really ask ourselves, how much of this stuff is really, have we come to believe authentically? How much of it is empty platitudes and just academic talking points? And how much of it is, how much of what's out there is original and coming from original minds, and how much of it is formulaic or just formalism, right? Which is the other problem. At the other extreme, you have the deconstructionism, and there's some nice impressionist stuff. It's not all bad, but it's it's the trend, right? It's the mindset that people fall into, where they're just trying to create effects. They're creating novelty. And so if we go back to the poetry around the fire test, I think a lot of what people consider great poems in contemporary works, or take the works of popular contemporary poets, the ones winning all the awards from these private family endowments, from basically the Anglo-American financial establishment, the Carnegie Trust, or the Mellon Trust. There are a lot of these
family endowments whose founders would have recoiled if they could see what their legacy was funding.
Yeah, that too. And some of it is elitism, right? A lot of the modern art stuff had a lot to do with catering to a certain kind of culture, and actually creating I'd say boundaries, between like what's increasingly became framed or considered mass culture, right? Like the just popular culture for the masses, which are like the Roman plebes, and they just need entertainment. And then you have the real erudite, Oxford graduates and their friends, and the lords and ladies. And
no, that's absolutely true.
Where it comes from. If people look at the history of modernism, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of this aristocratic mindset. Eugenics and these things were very popular among other ideas. But these kinds of ideas,
and we did talk about that in a previous podcast. Maybe you'll want to link that.
Yeah, we'll be talking about it more in the future as well. But I'd say that a lot of this stuff, all that to say, wouldn't pass the poetry around the fire test if you would read a lot of this stuff to just everyday people, right, that have regular lives and are totally open to an experience of beauty. But instead, what's been sold to people as beauty in our modern and contemporary age is largely just novelty. And it may appeal to a certain small, we're going to call it a fringe. It's a fringe. It's a small fringe. And it might appeal to them. But what about reading Homer, right? What about reading Dante? Do they have to have a degree? Do they have to have had read English at Oxford, to appreciate somebody reciting the Divine Comedy aloud around a fire, or in a church, or in a school auditorium, or at a social gathering, in somebody's living room? You don't need a degree to appreciate Dante. There's arguably infinite levels of appreciation, right? You can always get something new from it. And I think that's more what we need to get back to, and that can be done today. And that's the kind of work that we are featuring in our magazine, New Lyre. And that's what I think we need. I think there's plenty of the other stuff, so we can't say that there's not plenty of choice. But when it comes to this, I won't say more traditional, but I will just, people will get that there's a difference, right? When we're speaking about this timeless tradition, there's no reason that we can't have works created in that timeless tradition today, which are completely original, and that will pass the, poem around the fire test, where you can read this stuff to all sorts of different people, and they're going to be moved. They're going to appreciate it. They're going to be inspired.
Exactly. You're talking about the poem around the fire, and I like that analogy. There's a book out there. It's a couple decades old now. It's by John McWhorter, who is a Black professor at Columbia, and he's come into prominence more recently because he's been a outspoken critic of critical race theory. But this is an earlier work of his, and it's called Doing Our Own Thing, and it's about the decline of language and the quality of expression in the public discourse in America over the years.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a chapter in there where he likens poetry to marjoram, and marjoram, he says, every time you buy a spice rack, it comes with marjoram, but it's the one herb you never use. Incidentally, one of my favorite recipes calls for marjoram, but that aside, it's a humorous way of he's expressing, because poetry has gotten so esoteric, the only people creating poems and reading them to each other are other poets. So you have this circular dialogue, and it's largely moved out of the public discourse. Whereas back in the day, people would memorize poems, they would recite poems at public events. Not to get too personal, but even growing up, I never considered my family particularly literary. But my dad would always tell me, when he was a child and didn't want to get out of bed in the morning, my grandpa, who graduated high school and never had any formal education beyond that, would throw open the curtains and say, recite the first rubai of Omar Khayyam, wake for the sun who scattered into flight, etc.
Right.
And just everyday usage of poetry and everyday injection of poetry into everyday conversation and scenes of life, that was common in even as recently as my grandfather's generation, and we've seen that erode over the years. You can blame mass media, you can blame politicization of education, you can blame the popular culture, you can blame modernist trends in poetry, you can blame a lot of things, but I think the instinct is still there. I mean, you see, people quote song lyrics in similar situations. Those are largely filling that gap left that formal poetry once filled. So the need and the desire are both there, and I think now is as good an opportunity as any to resurrect the poetic culture we once had.
Yeah, and that actually makes me think of another conversation we were having about the whole the cynical Huxleyan Brave New World type of system, where, I mean, a lot of people saw that work as a sort of, forewarning of what was to come. But and there obviously there is some element of truth to that, but at the same time, I think you can actually look at the work and recognize that the underlying assumption about human nature, which is it's a very misanthropic, oligarchical view of human beings, where basically you can train the desire and thirst for beauty, for truth, for goodness, that you can basically create a blank slate, wipe the slate clean, get rid of all these innate desires and longings, and just reduce people to this Borg like, status under this kind of technocratic utopia, which we see we see an attempt to do that. I mean, Huxley had intimate knowledge of these things as well, but it rests on I'd say a
what we call the
fundamentally
NPC.
it rests under a fundamentally false assumption, which is that you can train these things out of people. And you were just saying, there's an instinct, right, when it comes to poetry.
Exactly.
And people can recognize it. And in fact, Edgar Allan Poe, there's a great essay he wrote, The Poetic Principle, where he talks about that. And he also talks about in a related essay, The Philosophy of Composition, he has similar ideas. He talks about his own composition of The Raven and how he was able to methodically go about how he was able to compose it based on various different considerations. How long was this going to be? What kind of emotions do I want to appeal to? And he talked about, melancholy, longing, and that he, in his other essay, The Poetic Principle, he talked about this idea, the poetic principle, and he talked about he described it as a thirst for immortality, that poetry has the effect of sort of pulling people upwards, or, taking them out of the moment and drawing them towards something, ironically, which is inexpressible or not directly perceivable, and yet they're somehow being pulled, they're being drawn, and people can feel it, right? There's a poetic power there. And so Poe in these essays is exploring how to make this intelligible, such that people can have a sense of how to approach the question of composition, such that these natural and innate human desires for beauty, truth, and goodness, which in Poe's language, he calls this an immortal instinct, right? The desire of the moth for the star, and how you can awaken that within people. And when you do, I mean, well, this is what it means to speak to their humanity, right? You're speaking to something deeper, and it cuts through all the sound bites, all the noise, right? All the academic jargon and intellectualism, and actually gets to something more substantive, and creates a situation where we can talk about certain kinds of ideas that we just can't talk about with literal speech or with simple prose. Such that, I mean, poetry is it's a natural thing, it's a necessary thing, but it's only necessary if we can rise to a certain level of discourse, right? It's only once you want to go to that higher level that you recognize this is necessary. And I mean, I'd say some of the best examples, I mean, look at the Bible, right? It's all parables, paradox, right? Look at prophets, look at poets. They're always using metaphor, they're always using parable, they're always using paradox. Now, is it?
And that's significant because
I would just add one thing, right? Is that because they just want to sound nice, right? Do they just want to sound like they have nice speech? Is this like the school of rhetoric? Is this from whether Rome or ancient Greece, or is it that the nature of the ideas that they are trying to communicate necessitates that they use a different mode of communication? And I would call that poetry. And you could call it by many names, but it's to awaken that something deeper, that something in the distance, Poe says, that longing in people, and which actually makes them feel human. And I don't think you can train that out of people. So I would say, for that reason, that much of what the attempt to bring our society under this kind of Brave New World / technocratic, dystopian system it's not going to work because it's based on a fundamentally false idea of humanity. Now, how many people is it going to hurt? That's another question. But the point is, it's not going to work.
Well, and that's why they want to change what it is to be human with this singularity and biological engineering and all that. But that's a conversation for another time.
Yeah, that's for our other podcast, Escaping the Brave New World. But you were going to say you chimed in when I was talking about the parable and paradox.
Well, okay. Well, a few things come to mind, but what I was going to say was, for a believer, the gospel, what the words of Christ in the Gospels are the words of God incarnate, and he chooses to tell stories, not to lay down the law, like you have in the Old Testament, but he tells stories, and I think that's significant, regardless of your faith or not. The ideas being and you'll read sort of overly academic analyses that dismiss it as saying, well, he was just talking to poor illiterate people in the backwards part of the empire, and he needed to speak in a way they could understand. But no, he's speaking in a way that reached them as much as it does us. And every time, I mentioned this to you earlier too, every time I reread these parables that I learned as a child, there's always something new I find, and they never get old. I know the stories, but if you read them, there's always a new twist, a new take, a new interpretation, something that comes up, and that, again, the word of God incarnate is speaking in stories, says something about the universality and the timelessness of storytelling and of poetry as a subset of that. And then turning back to my example of reciting the Rubaiyat while waking up your kid, that again, that's a situation that has both a universal experience. Everyone experiences the desire to keep sleeping, to enjoy the rest and not start the day. On the other hand, everyone also recognizes the symbolic meaning of light coming in, dispelling darkness, inactivity, yielding to human creativity and production, the sort of deeper meaning behind it. And that's a universal experience that everyone on this earth, regardless of time period, language, culture, experiences. So what someone who lived in Persia, a Muslim who lived in Persia 1,000 years ago, can write something that someone in 20th century America will relate to perfectly.
Absolutely, and very much so, right? Omar Khayyam is very popular. I mean, you read it and it speaks to you, right? It doesn't matter. The time and distance and place are quite relative when we're talking about the highest quality of poetic truth, right? And poetry and beauty. Time and place, spatial considerations are quite insignificant, relatively speaking. And I think that's where we get to the higher substance. And I mean, this is what we need poets to do, to get back to that, rather than trying to impress their professors, right? And or just being too caught up in their own cliques and their contemporary circles, where everybody's kind of saying, oh wow, that was so brave, or that was so good. And it's pretty much just, as you once put it, diary entries masquerading as poetry. And I mean, technically you can make a diary entry into a compelling piece of poetry, but the problem is much of it isn't compelling today so much as it is just self-referential, right? And as you wrote a whole essay on this as well. It's solipsism, right? It quickly devolves into narcissism, and I think that becomes pretty clear when you've read a few poems from different contemporary poets, and a pattern quickly emerges. And I think it's quite disturbing, but also it people outside of those circles, no one really consumes that, right? Nobody really seeks it out. So I think if people are not seeking poetry out today, it's not because poetry isn't one of the greatest vehicles for exploring and communicating and experiencing goodness, truth, and beauty, but because the poetry that has been popularized through various channels, and much of it for political reasons. There's a whole book called The Cultural Cold War, which talks about how modern art was used by the CIA. Here come the conspiracy theories, but they're conspiracy fact. There's a whole book anybody.
I have it on my bedside.
Yes, and we recommend it to everybody, and there is a book review coming out. I do have an article coming out called Ending the Cultural Cold War, Art, the CIA, and Psychological Warfare, which should be pretty fun. But just to say that we talked about there's all these private family trusts and endowments, and they're in the book, for example, it describes by the author is Frances Stoner Saunders, British journalist. I hope I said her name right. But
sounds right to me.
The CIA in the World of Arts and Letters, and she even describes that there's a moment where the Congress for Cultural Freedom representatives, where the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CCF, was a front for the CIA, and it was funded by dozens and dozens and dozens of private foundations and charities and all that. They even moved to try and to stop Pablo Neruda from winning the Nobel Prize in Literature, because he was, a quote unquote commie. And so they didn't want somebody like that to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. And they started a gossip campaign, right? A whispering campaign in order to dissuade the Nobel Prize judges from selecting a poet who had communist sympathies. And so much of modern abstract impressionism, especially, but modernism in general, was being used to promote freedom of expression, right? It's always free. It's always about freedom, right? But it was meant to counterpose this idea of freedom and democracy versus the admittedly rigid Soviet style realism, right? And so it was meant to create a counterpoint between this very rigid and oppressive kind of world versus this free and democratic world. But the irony, right, is it's always been framed as art for art's sake, freedom of expression. The irony is that at every turn, all these modern music festivals, modern art festivals, the decision to support these things was always political. It was always about creating a certain image for the world of what the free world was, and that the free world, right, America, had culture, because the Soviet Union, one of the big sort of clubs that they had against the whole idea of the American the Pax Americana and all that, was that they didn't really have much culture. Like that was an attack point, right? Despite its problems, I mean, the Soviet Union, it had a longer, or they were, they had Pushkin, they had all sorts of.
Well, I mean, the Soviet Union was the heir of the Russian Empire, and which was one of the most cultured, highly developed cultures of the 19th century. And then number two, the one thing the Soviet Union did successfully was foster the development of artists, through government support. I mean, you had Shostakovich, you had Khachaturian, Prokofiev, who went after he returned to the Soviet Union. You had, I think, Ilya Repin in his later years was state supported. you had all you had it was a trade union like, the carpenters or the, steel workers or what have you, and they, they were part of the government support. So you had a continuation of the earlier Russian culture supported in the Soviet Union, and they knew it and they bragged about it, and you can see propaganda posters that exalt their own artists and denigrate America as a, degenerate society where, artists could only find work, playing in cabarets or for Hollywood or
Yeah, they're uncultured.
lowbrow entertainment like that.
Yeah, they're uncultured, crass, and they just like baseball. That I mean, this is really what cultural warfare, psychological warfare is about, right? Because it's about the image that you create of the enemy, and then winning the hearts and minds of everybody who's in between, right? There's only a very small select grouping waging this kind of ideological, cultural, political intel warfare on either side. And then there's always the greater, the population at large, where it's a question of winning the hearts and minds of people. And so all that to say that a lot of what people just treat as, art for art's sake and freedom of expression and stuff, which is the first thing that comes up as soon as you start trying to critique a contemporary work, from
Yes, you become an oppressor.
you're a fascist. You're just a fascist, and it always comes back to that. But
well, that's, if I may, that's another element that plays into this too, particularly with the Frankfurt School and Theodor Adorno, particularly.
Exactly.
Was there was, the first thing, and this is as old as history, the first thing you do to a defeated enemy is take their gods away. You destroy their idols. And after, in the wake of World War II, there was a broad-based war, not just against Nazism, but against German culture more broadly, as supposedly the culture that incubated this horrible regime. And there was a active suppression of, again, Germany, which was the cultural gem of Europe throughout the 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries. This was the culture that brought forth Bach and Beethoven and Richard Strauss and Wagner and Goethe and Schiller and the philosophers and scientists. There was an active war against all of that, and that's in a large part what, and the spread of that culture to the masses, that really uplifted them from cultural poverty, which had the art and literature had formerly been something accessible to the elites only. And there was an active effort to suppress, German culture as it was.
Absolutely, it was. I mean, it was the denazification of Germany, right? It was German re-education, is what they called it. I mean, the American High Commission in Germany, run by, for a time, this guy John J. McCloy. I mean, very high level Anglo-American intel operatives, right? There was a very concerted effort to re-educate, but that's the catch, right? So there was like, we have to train authoritarianism out of people, and this goes to Adorno, right? They had the whole authoritarian personality project. But here's the catch, and this is how it always works. I mean, there's always, the greatest lies have just the right amount of truth, right? They're going to put in some truth, but then they're going to slip in something, and you're supposed to just swallow the thing wholesale. They pretty much said any objective standard of beauty, right? Any objective aesthetic judgment was, you're on the road to hell. You're on the road to authoritarianism, right? Any sort of belief in the objective reality of ideas, of something beyond what you can just directly touch, taste, hear, see, or smell. Any belief that there were such things was ultimately the belief in some sort of like authoritarian or totalitarian system, right? You're going to
you were a Nazi if you believed in truth.
Because you're going to try and impose abstractions on the physical world, and therefore you're going to have to murder a lot of people to make them work, because ultimately, all abstractions are false. That's the thinking. So all you have, we've come full circle, is really,
which is funny, because what you have today is the imposition of that view by authoritarianism.
Absolutely. And the word here is, one of the words is lived experience, right? We've all heard that. Mm-hmm. But that's the complete eradication of the belief or adherence to any sort of higher law, natural law, or belief in any sort of idea, whether it's justice, truth, beauty. You had to destroy all that. And here, full circle again, deconstructionism, right? You have to break it all up, right? So the idea is you have to destroy all these things. You have to deconstruct the language if we're going to rebuild it into something new, which ultimately means rebuild it into the image of, the ruling, oligarchical system. It's kind of Brave New World type system. You have to destroy the language, right? So art was actually, this was the first column, right, to fall. It was to first, it's just aesthetics, right? Well, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, sure. But it's ultimately, it's that everything is relative, right? It ultimately, it was always going there. That was always the intention. But it was understood that, if you're going to change a culture, if you really want to change the way people think, you got to change their art. You got to change their culture. You got to change their stories. You have, or rewrite the stories that people live their lives by. If you really want to control people, change their story, right? And so we see that at the whole center of the current political and culture wars is the battle to rewrite the past, right? To rewrite history, because your understanding of history is not in the past. It's actually, it has an immediate bearing on who you think you are, and therefore where you think you should be going. And so if you want to change how people think about themselves and these things, especially on a broader societal or global scale, well, why not just change their story? Why not reframe it in subtle ways, where even just a subtle tweaking of a very familiar story all of a sudden leads to a very different outlook on the world. And I'd say, like, for example, just as a concrete example, there's a story of Prometheus who stole fire from the gods. Some people tell that story as Prometheus was the hubristic, man who defied Zeus, defied the gods, and he was punished for his hubris in thinking that he could defy the gods in favor of man. But then there's the Aeschylus version, right, where the gods are pretty degenerate. Number one, Zeus and they're not good people. They're oligarchs. And Prometheus, he doesn't even sacrifice himself, but he sacrifices himself. He doesn't die because he's a titan. He's immortal, but he exposes himself to almost, eternal torture. There is a twist at the end. But the point is, he exposes himself to the greatest level of pain and suffering possible for a titan, for the sake of humanity, right? For the sake of giving humanity knowledge of fire. And so if you're an oligarch, you could try and take that story and reframe it, right? And twist it and say, well, knowledge of fire is very dangerous, right? Man is quite stupid, and he's just going to destroy everything, and he's going to blow everything up. So we need to control fire. And basically, the idea becomes that if you
Well,
can't,
especially given the situation at the time with the development of nuclear arms, that became the war cry for, global government, increased control. Look what we'll do with this new quote unquote this new technology.
yeah. And I mean, so all that to say that changing the story has big implications. And I can hear, I was hearing myself saying, commenting on our discussion, more like maybe some people listening where this sounds kind of political. But I mean, there's the rub. I mean, if we're really talking about art here and people just want to treat it like it's just words on a page and that's all it is, and it's just craftsmanship, and we can't really talk about anything else, everything else is just ideological. Well, no, actually, if you look at the history of the development of these things, various movements, the genesis of various isms, you're going to have to look at the political dynamics in which these things arose, because we don't live in a vacuum and ideas don't just come out of nowhere. And often the ideas that people have in their heads, I mean, this is true for most of us, most of the ideas that we have are not our own, right? They came from somewhere. And I think real wisdom and knowledge actually comes from not saying, okay, we're all dumb, none of us have any original ideas, but that ideas have a history, and knowing where the ideas that you have in your head actually come from, like their true origins and genesis and history, versus the narratives that are used to frame ideas in a specific way so that it's, expedient for XYZ, strategic or political reason. Then you get a better sense of where your own mind is, the nature of your own ideas. And I mean, looking at where some of the popular ideas that are popular today actually come from, a lot of it comes from very dark places. I mean, modernism, unfortunately, is also one of them. It has a very dark past in many respects, though we're not going to go too much into that today. Though we've talked about this in a previous podcast. I believe it's called Modernism, Eugenics, and something. We'll link it in the description. But there's also a much longer version of that story and discussion. But I would recommend that book to everybody, The CIA in the World of Arts and Letters, The Cultural Cold War, as a primer, right? Just to get people sort of into appreciating the political dynamics that have shaped culture throughout the 20th century, but that there's always usually some kind of dynamic shaping the cultural, aesthetic, and other dimensions of a society. And the point is, we just want to be mindful of that, because if we actually want to, write and say original things or publish original poetry, we should have an appreciation for where ideas come from, because that's ultimately what the poems are reflecting. They're reflecting a universe, right? They're reflecting the universe that the poet inhabits, and the poem is really like a flash, a snapshot of that universe. I mean, look at Dante. Look at what universe did Dante live in? What universe did Homer live in?
If it's worth expressing, it's going to have political implications. You can't avoid that. I mean, I'm agreeing with you ultimately.
Yeah, but the irony is that even a lot of the stuff that people, right, because we're talking about this authoritarian, this push against, being able to critique art in any other way outside of, this very narrow contemporary sort of or modernist mindset and aesthetic, and that somehow, you're a fascist if you do. But because it's just supposed to be about freedom of expression and, art for art's sake, which is really just, existentialism masquerading as art for art's sake. But there's a background, there's a story behind these things. And I think knowing that story is part of knowing our own story. And the more we know about our own story, right, our real story, the better equipped we are to write the next chapters.
Yeah, it's exactly. It's, I don't want to use a cliche, but you're lighting your pathway forward. These these ideas, how they're shaped, how they've played out, guide you forward, so you're not groping around in the dark.
Yeah, you know what? That's perfect. Why don't we read the first poem? You set it up with what you just said now.
Okay, all right.
We're just gonna accent our conversation with poetry, make it a bit of, yeah. I think that's a nice combo right there. In answer to speaking to the spirit of what you just said, very briefly or touched on. So this is one of the poems featured in our new issue of New Lyre for the winter 2022 issue. This is called The Veil of Soul Making by Daniel Leach. I haven't practiced reading it out loud, but I will try and deliver at least try and capture the spirit of it. So this is The Veil of Soul Making. Down from some dim, distant star it glimmers through the leafy shadows of this veil, but unnoticed in their eyes it shimmers as they make love in the moonlight pale, never heeding, not yet knowing, a new soul already growing that will soon its first bright sunny morning hail. What will be its little journey's meaning? What part of fond blessing or dark curse? Will the soul of our small world be leaning on a path for better or for worse? And when it becomes a lover, will it into another's eyes discover all the hidden beauty in the universe? In the child's imagination playing, there are secret dreams more true and real than the words we hear our mind's voice saying, that we often don't believe or feel. But when, in our deepest yearning, for that happy state returning, all the world seems glowing as if pure, ideal. When in darkest moments the soul faring, lost as if in endless tangled wood, when of all hope in the world despairing, of all beauty and all human good, on the moment's shadows fretting, all and its own self forgetting, even that simple truth is understood. Even that simple truth it once understood. Then suddenly, into a small clearing, stumbling, eyes fixed on the shadowed ground, overhead unnoticed are appearing stars and planets sparkling all around. Through the wild and feverish dreaming, they were there, forever beaming, like light of that lost home the wanderer found. Beautiful.
Beautiful and pregnant with meaning.
Pregnant indeed.
Yeah, it's a very I hate to use the word deep, but that's the word that comes to mind.
You had said,
not,
sorry.
it's substantial. It's not fluff. Reading it is like eating a steak, versus potato chips.
You said lighting the path forward, and that's what triggered me to think about this poem, because it says like light of that lost home the wanderer found. I mean, so yeah, it's like finding home in a sense, getting back to these things that the thing that's been calling right in the background, that so often we don't hear it, right, because of all the noise, but it doesn't mean it's not there. Just like he says, the planets and the stars. I mean, especially if you're in their city, or maybe you don't see the stars every night, which is which is a shame. But all that to say, yeah, that what you said made me think about that, and I think that's like you said, it's a very meaty poem, spiritually meaty and meaty in beauty. But there's there's a lot of different, I guess this is not a bad time to talk about the issue a bit. I mean, and we feature, you're pretty much our chief essayist at this point, since you always write the long essays for our magazines. I think we have a good tradition going. So you wrote Climbing the Alps, The Vision of Ezra Pound, which is a very, very auspicious, very scholarly, very impressive essay. And we can maybe touch on that a bit more after. But all that to say, we have a lot of different forms. We have a whole selection of beautiful, beautiful, prime, translations by Michael R. Birch, who is a great English poet in his own right, but that also makes him a good translator, which doesn't always translate either, one way or the other, but it does in this case. And so we have even some of the Chinese classical odes translated, the very same ones that Confucius was so emphatic about, thousands of years ago. So we present those. We have several of Goethe's greatest ballads, right, written at the peak of when he was at the peak of his poetic and imaginative powers. We have a lot of original poetry from quite a few talented poets, and we give a good selection for most contributors, so people can really get a sense of the different original voices that are out there, right? Just to show people that it can still be done today. And so, yeah, we have a lot of different themes, a lot of different forms, from sonnets to, shall we call them, philosophical poems, ballads. What else do we have in here? Blank verse, all sorts of beautiful, smaller but very dense strophic poems, right? Just a few stanzas, but it really leaves you with something that stays with you. And we also have a huge selection of ancient haiku, just to give people a sense of, right, the theme is the East meets West to a certain degree. That's not the only theme, but the exploration of timeless beauty expressed in both the East and West, and the complementarity that we can find, where I think, anybody.
Hence the selection of Ezra Pound for our essay.
Pardon me?
Hence the selection of Ezra Pound for our essay. Yes,
which brings it all together, which is the beautiful thing, is that, magically almost, the journal is thoroughly composed, right? It has all these different kinds of poems. It has a very rich selection of translation, and then it has a very, very strong and dense essay that sort of ties everything in together, from the new original stuff to the ancient traditions to where we find ourselves today. And it does all this by taking the case of Ezra Pound and his vision, which I guess you should probably say something at this point about that, since I'm talking about it.
Well, sure. Without giving away too much, what people overlook in Ezra Pound, he's an easy target to attack because of his association with Mussolini's government and his unrepentant support of it.
Bad political choices, but let's put it this way: most of the modernists had bad political taste. That's go on
and continue to. Yeah, I would submit.
In our
but if we look past that, Ezra Pound was really one of the first English-speaking poets to bring the work of the Chinese and Japanese classics into English. His translations in his younger years, Cathay is his most famous volume, were groundbreaking at the time. It was the first that the everyday English reader would have encountered Chinese and Japanese poetry. And Pound's philosophy throughout his cantos, but even more broadly, was to, I won't say fuse, but to bring in Eastern culture as a supplement to the Western historical tradition, to build a more solid foundation for the future. In other words, we have the Western cultural experience, starting, you could go as far back as ancient Egypt, but certainly Greece, Rome, medieval Europe, forward to America, etc. And then you have this whole separate, just as ancient tradition in China, and then also in Japan, and you could even say Korea, Southeast Asia, that built off of the Chinese culture. And it serves as an additional guide, an additional reference, an additional frame of reference, rather, to the Western cultural tradition. And what's lost, Ezra Pound's poetry is, it's impressionism on steroids. He in his early days was a founder of what is called the Vorticist school, which is glorified cubism. It's cubism. I'm sorry, I said impressionism. I meant cubism.
Right.
It's cubism with an emphasis on motion and action, and in inaction and stillness as a contrast. But it's ultimately cubist. And when you understand that, that was really the key to cracking T.S. Eliot's poetry, to understanding T.S. Eliot's poetry. And it's the same key to crack Pound's poetry, except Pound is much more obscure than Eliot, in that he'll quote languages in their original, including obsolete languages like medieval Italian, or medieval Tuscan rather, or he'll put Chinese in long passages of Chinese in their original. So you have to have it's not just a matter of piecing the images together. You actually have to have a lengthy background to understand what's going on. And to some degree that's true with Eliot, but I think it's even more so with Pound. But anyway, leaving aside his poetics, I think the fundamental idea he had about, not I won't say fusing, but about bringing together East and West, I think is a laudable goal. And I think it is lost in the conversation we all have about Pound today.
Right. And I mean, I would just, let's put it this way. Like, we're not in a vacuum, right? This whole idea that, you just have like Italian culture, or you have English culture, or you have whatever, British culture, French culture, Nigerian culture, as if there hasn't always been a dialogue among cultures, and there hasn't always been a migration of ideas, right? Ideas are things. Just because we can't see them, I mean, you can see ideas rippling over time, right? Across and making their way through various civilizations, changing, developing, forming. There are nascent ideas, right? And then they grow to fruition, and maybe they die for a while and they come back in a different form. Whether it's the idea of, a republic, or, a democratic system. I mean, it's not like America was exactly Plato's republic. And I mean, maybe that was a good thing in part, right? Some things changed. The perspective of various things changed, or maybe there were, still some mistakes made. Obviously, these are wider questions, but the whole point is that there's always this context. We're not in a vacuum. And it actually, if we're saying that culture is always developing, then yeah, the leap the transcendence between just East and West culture, which itself is, I mean, it's useful to make distinctions to a certain degree, just because we want to be able to talk about certain particular things, right? Or speak to different nuances. But I think it's important to never get lost in these dichotomies, because they're ultimately, whether it's Eastern or Western art, Western or Eastern classical art, they're striving, there's the same longing for the eternal, towards a timeless quality of beauty, of truth, and goodness. That's there. Doesn't matter where you go. So the language culture changes, the predicates change, the mediums may change, right? Chinese classical painting is not exactly, Renaissance style chiaroscuro, not to sound like some, I know how to say it, but all that to say, it depends, right? There's a lot of things change. It's another thing we often talk about. Or at least this is a way I think is very useful to talk about, and I keep bringing it up and you keep responding, so maybe it's just me talking about it. But the idea of the changing and the unchanging, I mean, Plato talked about this, the one and the many, but you have these things that are changing, right, in between Eastern and Western art in terms of the mediums, the styles. I mean, the Chinese were not big in terms of painting on the chiaroscuro, right, the sort of Renaissance style. And I mean, their backgrounds, right, they left a lot of blank space. There were certain things, there were certain criteria that had to be met, and it was very stringent. But these are parts of the changing elements, or they are elements of the changing dimension of things, of reality, versus the unchanging, right, which is this striving for the eternal beauty, for eternal ideas, for truth, beauty, and goodness. So and that's something that has to be rediscovered with each generation, right? I mean, it's not like a football, you just pick it up and it's something you have to keep picking up. It's something that each generation has to keep discovering. And I mean, it's kind of like truth. You could say that the truth, or is the truth really something that we just get the final answer and then we're done? Or is it a practice? Is it also a practice? It's something that you have to constantly rediscover, something that takes on new meaning, and something that you have to practice, right? It has to be directed, because just being an ivory tower philosopher and thinking you have all the answers and not really doing anything, I mean, is that truth, really? Is having the nice, clean, formulaic answers and like a perfect, crystalline map of everything, I mean, does that really necessarily translate into good, into truth, into beauty? I don't know. All that to say that I think there are certain things that are unchanging, and so art is always rediscovering that, always exploring that in different ways, with each new generation, and and across various cultures, and there's always a dialogue. So it's natural, I mean, to have that process. And in this respect, that's what Pound was exploring in his work, studying exploring the complementarity of Eastern styles. Eastern verse has a very because of the nature of the language, right? It's very economical, very dense forms of expression, and it's quite powerful when we explore that in English verse. I think it's very interesting, and it's quite fruitful. I mean, there's so much to say. Why don't I read some just a few, give people a taste of these some of the Oriental translations that we have.
Sure.
And that ties into, why Pound is talking about this stuff in the first place, right? And why you decided to write about it today in 2022. First fun, short, very short. Let's see. So this is by Li Bai. Note by Michael Birch. Li Bai was a romantic figure who has been called the Lord Byron of Chinese poetry. He and his friend Du Fu were the leading poets of the Tang Dynasty era, which has been called the golden age of Chinese poetry. Li Bai is also known as Li Po, Li Pai, Li Tao Po, and Li Tai Pai. This is just a couplet. A toast to Uncle Yun. Water reforms, although we slice it with our swords. Sorrow returns, although we drown it with our wine. Now, the Red Cockatoo. These are a few short poems, so I'll just read them and you can give your impression, Adam. The Red Cockatoo. This is by Po Chu Yi. I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but I'm trying. Po Chu Yi, he lived from 772 to 846. Okay, so I mean, it's over 1,000 years ago. So things have definitely changed since that time. But let's see what they have to say. The Red Cockatoo. A marvelous gift from Annam, a red cockatoo, bright as peach blossom, fluent in men's language. So they did what they always do to the erudite and eloquent. They created a thick barred cage and shut it up. One more. Okay, so here's an ancient ode. Ancient Chinese rhyming notes by Birch, ancient Chinese rhyming poem circa 1200 BC to 600 BC. Xi Jing ode, or Xi Jing, I believe it's pronounced, ode number 4, Zhu. In the south, beneath the trees with drooping branches, thick with vines that make them shady, we find our lovely princely lady. May she repose in happiness. In the south, beneath the trees with drooping branches whose clinging vines make hot days shady, we wish love's embrace for our lovely lady. May she repose in happiness. In the south, beneath the trees with drooping branches whose vines entwining make them shady, we wish true love for our lovely lady. May she repose in happiness. Isn't that nice? I mean, this is a simple poem. I don't know what you think. I have a lot of thoughts on these seemingly simple and tight verses. But yeah, any thoughts?
Oh, many thoughts.
That's it.
The Li Bai poem you began with, for being so short, it's filled with, the begins with the word water, ends with wine. It compares, in the one the liquid is being cut, in the other the liquid is doing the cutting. I mean, there's just so many contrasts and
dense, so dense. My goodness.
For a simple couplet, it's impressive. And then there's the irony. This is a toast. Presumably this is a happy occasion, and we're talking about the sorrow returning after we're done partying here. It's sort of a memento mori moment here, placing things into context.
Yeah, I mean, just the density, right? That's what struck me with other verses as well that I've read, right? Just in brief, in very small spaces. There's a lot of meaning that's packed in, and I mean, there's so much that can be learned from that, and so much that can be inspired from that today.
And that leads to the Xi Jing. I actually have an edition of the Xi Jing, and in the notes, these are the oldest recorded or written poems because they've been preserved. Confucius directed his disciples to memorize them because of the life lessons they contain, and because Chinese society was heavily Confucian in its outlook, these odes were preserved. And in fact, now knowing them was a prerequisite for passing the civil service exam. You had to not only know and have them memorized, but you had to be able to interpret them convincingly. You would write an essay on it. So there have been various interpretations of these poems. Most of them focus on, I mean, this one in particular, I don't recall reading an interpretation, but some of them are quite, I would say, tortuous interpretations. But these had to be known and interpreted, and often the interpretations would relate in some way to duty, respect, things that were within the social order of the day, that were really, in a sense, political. So again, we have,
Right.
From these songs praising the lady as she's going to her wedding. I'm assuming, you could read all sorts of levels of interpretation into this. And then the Red Cockatoo, that's just a fun poem. It's direct in its message. And I laughed when you read the last couple lines. They created a thick barred cage and they shut it up. But
Yeah.
it's funny because it's true.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much that could be said. And these are just three small poems, right? Just to give people a sense. This issue is it's 181 pages. Okay. So, I mean, we read just a few lines here just to give people a sense. If we can have, I mean, we could talk about just these three poems for the rest of the podcast. We're not going to do that. It would almost be funny if we, like, how long can we talk about this stuff for? That might be an interesting experiment. Like, let's do a 10-hour podcast.
Don't take us up on that bet.
On two lines. Sorry, what?
I said, don't take us up on that bet.
Yeah, but I that would almost be funny, like, let's do people doing a 10-hour podcast on like two lines of poetry, just seeing how much they can unpack. And at the end of the 10 hours, it's just like we haven't even scratched the surface, right? The deeper you go, the more depth you discover is possible, which I think is, well, isn't that the great thing about poetry and great art and ideas? I mean, you can always go deeper. Hence the need to always rediscover this stuff, and it takes on new meaning, and it's important to pass this stuff down. There are no dead white European males when it comes to the great poets, because poets are immortal. Great artists are immortal. So, I mean, spoiler alert, Homer's not dead. Dante's not dead. None of these people are dead. Keats is not dead. Shelley's not dead. Poe's not dead. And that's what we're excited about bringing to people today. What does this spirit, what forms can this spirit take today? And exploring how this spirit, I mean, Shelley has a whole ode, or a hymn to intellectual beauty, which basically talks about beauty as the spirit that takes all these various forms across the world. I mean, I feel like that's a very apt metaphor. I mean, it's more true than anything you could just say in purely descriptive or literal terms, right? It speaks to the idea that there's a principle animating the universe and human beings, right? Which is, it tends towards beauty, to creativity, right? To the further elaboration and development of eternal truths, of eternal things, which by their nature are inexhaustible. And so, I mean, we're never going to get bored. if we're actually taking these things seriously, which is, I mean, that's good news, right? That sounds pretty exciting. Versus the more contemporary trends, which are largely, the pursuit of novelty, right? And lots of kitsch, right? And lots of just very sort of fleeting moments of experience. And people are not even thinking about what the latest piece of art means, right? I mean, I'm in Montreal, okay? Downtown, we have all sorts of crazy things going on. I mean, there's literally, the church is literally a circus. Just to there's a big church in the center of downtown, and it actually houses a circus. And I mean, it's a metaphor, but it's not, it's real. But there's a lot of stuff going on, all sorts of different expositions and things. But I have nothing against it, but it feels very fleeting. And it is, right? There's just like a giant pink ear on the corner, just to make it concrete. Like, that's the kind of thing I see. And what is this doing to people? And right, the retort is not doing anything. But actually, no, it is. Just not in the way people think, but on a meta level, right, on a higher level, in terms of what art's purpose has been, right, in sort of passing down ideas. And yeah, you sort of touched on it. I when I heard what you were saying about the Xi Jing ode, right, and the sort of, it's kind of espousing or promoting the social order of the day and all that. And I think people have a kind of gag reflex today when they hear that kind of stuff. Not everybody, but or it gets to this, right? So Plato's this authoritarian. Plato's pretty much
that's the politically correct reaction is to have an aversion to that.
Plato's pretty much just Kim Jong-un, right? If you ask like the modern scholars, and he just wanted to, poetry has to be this, it can't be this. We need to ban all the poets, as if Plato, number one, was a pure literalist, and he's literally just like making ironclad decrees. There's zero nuance, right? He's definitely not creating some sort of irony or trying to challenge you to think about something in a different way. He's definitely not doing any of that. It's all literal. Don't think more about it. And anybody who tells you there's any sort of objective purpose or effect of art, that art has any sort of objective effect, that maybe kids listening to all sorts of different music does have an effect on their world outlook, and this world outlook translates into real world behavior, a lot of which is you only really see that it's a problem once it gets really bad, which is partly the problem, because all this stuff happens very gradually over time. So it takes a few generations before people are like, whoa, what happened? And then there's pink ears on the street corner, and the churches are literally, housing mimes and jugglers. Not that there's anything wrong with these things, but you know what I mean? It's everything is sort of turned upside down. And if people are really serious about these things, there's a history to this stuff. It didn't just come out of the blue. And these discussions that we're having about art, the nature of art, the effect of art, right, the purpose of art, rather than just this empty, freedom of expression, when it's not, when it's very disingenuous actually, and it's not freedom of expression. If, for example, we look at the Congress for Cultural Freedom, it was never about freedom of expression. It was almost always a political, calculated decision to frame one culture one way and frame another culture another way, both of the frames largely being deceptive, but ultimately serving some sort of political or cultural purpose. So these are all things, unfortunately, and they're important to know about. And so when we're looking at a Xi Jing ode from like 1200 BC, it's a big deal, right? There's a lot that can be said about that, and the meaning of this for people today, right? And what art was doing back then, what it's doing today, what it can do, what it should do, what it may do. These are all things worth investigating, but it means sort of going beyond these you know, these empty platitudes like just art for art's sake and freedom of expression, and not recognizing that all this stuff really plays out on the stage of history, right? All these ideas, you know, they're dramatized in like the actual cultures that we have. And I think we're at a critical juncture, and that's why it's so exciting to be putting out New Lyre's second issue with the themes that it has and with all the original content that it does have. I mean, 2022, it's a very auspicious year, I believe, for art, for poetry, and for ideas, because the world is really changing. And I think you're definitely going to see that reflected in the art, in the poetry.
I couldn't agree more.
Yes.
And I think that's a good place to conclude.
Yes, that is not a bad place to conclude, and we will conclude with a poem. Well, we'll conclude after concluding with the poem too. We'll say a few final words. But I'm just thinking of the spirit of what we're talking about, and I'm just, you know, a poem just popped up that I feel like at least leaves people on an interesting note. Something. So this is actually one of my poems. Not that I don't want to seem like a shameless plugger here, but everything we've been talking about in terms of it, exploring the East-West theme is actually what I was thinking about when I wrote these poems before I even had the idea for New Lyre. So it's not like it, you know.
Well, I was going to ask you to read one of your poems too, just because it's nice to have the poet actually recite their own work.
Right. Right. And it seems, I mean, this sort of ties in the whole East-West thing as well. So I figure, why not? We've all been thinking about this stuff. I mean, you and I, Adam, for a while. And so it comes out in our works, in our essays. And it turns out that we're not alone, though, right? When you know, did your work on Pound, you found out that, hey, it's, you know, people have been thinking about this, and other people are thinking about similar ideas. And those also inspire a whole, I'm sure people listening are probably going to have all sorts of ideas and thoughts, which they are welcome to share in the comment section. So with that said, this is one of the philosophical vignettes from the Chinese Mountain Man series, which was inspired by Chinese classical painting, which I really love, especially the song landscapes. They're very sublime. And so I was thinking about the old master and pupil, sage and pupil metaphor, trope, them exploring, wandering through the mountains on a journey. What would happen? What would they say? You know, that's how I started. And I just had the sense of the economy, right, of Oriental verse, that density, and the often couplets, right? The Li Bai, there's several couplets that we feature, like the one we read, and it was just very inspiring. So how to explore this kind of density in English. So this one's called The Drifters. The sage and pupil journeyed on into a darkened valley glade, whose air was laden with the scent of unctuous, bitter saps. For many nights they carried on, sheltered beneath the forest canopies, but no light seemed to guide their way. No light, but that of starlit streams. The travelers listened to a choir of cicadas singing their song. The summer breezes drifted through a fog-enveloped maze of oaks. Some people walk the night, said the sage, but no clear path reveals itself. They wander never knowing that they lost the road so long ago. The sage went on. Then there are those who journey through the denser woods. They fear they might be found. He stopped and peered into the starlit stream. So that was one of 18 philosophical vignettes. I think there's 18. So yeah, I mean, we've just read a few things, really cursory. I mean, technically this podcast could have gone on for 5 hours and we probably still would have not touched a significant portion of the works in this magazine. So I would encourage everybody. You have a nephew, you have a niece, you have a grandchild, you like poetry yourself. Uh, get yourself a copy. Gift this. I mean, the gift of poetry. I hope that's not cliche. I mean, it should be. Let's hope it becomes popular. So yeah, I would encourage people, give the gift of poetry. You can go to newlyre.com and get a copy of our magazines, and definitely let us know what you think in the comments. And with that said, thank you, Adam, for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to have these discussions.
Absolutely. So we'll be back very soon, and thank you all for listening.